A warm welcome to all of you all over the world to a very exciting and important event today entitled Making Peace with Nature, Heeding the Call of Indigenous Peoples. I'm Charles McNeill. I'm with the United Nations Environment Program, and it's my honor to moderate this event and to introduce you in a moment to some extraordinary leaders. Today, we will hear from very senior leaders in a range of religious traditions, including leaders from the Anglican, Episcopal, Muslim, Jewish, and Sikh faiths. And we will hear from indigenous leaders from the Arctic and North America who are also senior leaders in their Christian churches. And we're going to hear how they're influencing their faith communities and having a significant impact. We will also hear from indigenous leaders from Africa and the Amazon. During the next 70 minutes, we will learn about the powerful ways that religious leaders from the Arctic to the Equator are working with indigenous peoples on environment and climate solutions. I think we all understand here at COP and all around the world that action on climate comes down to political will. I think we can also agree that a new urgency, energy, and momentum is needed to generate the kind of political will required to stimulate climate action at the level needed to stimulate transformational change. For this, religious leaders and faith communities have a potentially enormous contribution to make to meeting the Paris climate goals. They have the moral authority, global reach, the political power and influence needed. And we're already seeing significant evidence of their impact around the world. As we will discuss, we're also seeing evidence of a powerful and positive new kind of relationship between religious leaders and indigenous leaders, the stewards of vast areas of our planet. And this change in relationship could really help avert a climate catastrophe. In fact, all of the sponsors of this event, Religions for Peace, the World Council of Churches, the Anglican Communion, and the Episcopal Church are all deeply involved in a global effort called the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, or IRI, through which religious leaders from all traditions are joining forces with indigenous peoples to protect tropical forests and indigenous peoples' rights. So we will learn from the experiences of IRI today, and we'll hear a significant and very exciting announcement about the future of IRI, among other important topics. So let me now introduce some of these distinguished speakers. First is Professor Aza Karam. She serves as the Secretary General of Religions for Peace, the largest multi-religious leadership platform with 92 national and 6 regional interreligious councils. She also holds a professorship of religion and development at the Vierde University in the Netherlands. She has had a long and distinguished career in the United Nations over the previous 15 years. And Professor Karam's doctorate was on political Islam, and this became her first book, and since then she's published widely on democratization, human rights, peace, and security. Professor Karam and the Religions for Peace has been a dynamic supporter of the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative. Please, let's hear from Professor Aza Karam.
Greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum. For each and every one of you, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you here today. I wish I could be physically with you, but it seems like you have enough people at this COP. Let's hope that it can emerge with exactly what we all need in this world, which is a strategic vision and several plans of action that can keep us working together. Talking about strategic vision and plans of action, allow me first and foremost to thank Dr. Charles McNeill for his expert moderation. And also to express that the organization I'm privileged to serve, Religions for Peace, is honored to be in this convening in full partnership with the World Council of Churches, the Anglican Communion, and the Episcopal Church. Religions for Peace is the United Nations of religious institutions and faith communities around the world. Because we believe in working together, the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative is a leading example of what this commitment to serve together actually looks like in action. The Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, otherwise known as IRI, was launched at the Nobel Peace Center in June of 2017. And it's an international alliance working to harness the moral influence of religions and their leaders for the protection of rainforests. and the rights of Indigenous peoples. They go together. We protect our lungs. We protect Indigenous peoples. To that extent, we now work as an Interfaith Rainforest Initiative in 5 countries: Brazil, Colombia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Indonesia, and Peru. These 5 countries together contain the majority of the world's remaining rainforests. In 2019, Religions for Peace was able to mobilize a historic commitment where over 900 senior religious leaders from more than 125 countries, representing over 1 billion people around the world, endorsed the Faiths for Forests Declaration and Action Agenda, and agreed to work with and through the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative on this critical topic. This commitment, by the way, was offered as an official contribution to the UN Secretary General's Climate Action Summit 2 years ago. Rabbi Rosen, one of our leading members in Religions for Peace, and is participating in this program, was a key contributor to both the launch of the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative at the Nobel Peace Center, as well as the launch of the Faiths for Forest Declaration and Action Agenda, and the reaffirmation of commitment to IRI, Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, that took place where? In Lindau, Germany, just a few weeks ago. We're really pleased and deeply grateful that the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative has made remarkable progress in mobilizing these faith movements in all 5 program countries for the protection not just of our forests, i.e. our lungs, but also for the rights of Indigenous peoples. They go together. We protect Indigenous peoples. We protect our lungs. It is appropriate then that at an event about the confluence of religious leaders working with Indigenous people on environment and climate solutions, there should be a major announcement on the next phase of the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative program. Nothing ever happens just with speaking. A lot happens because someone somewhere makes available the resources that will catalyze the actions, that will help realize the visions, that will help bring together people to serve. We're therefore deeply grateful to the government of Norway, which has been very generous and effective in its leadership on the whole climate, forest, and Indigenous peoples' rights agenda. We hope that the example that the government of Norway continues to set will inspire other governments to work together. Note that not just giving resources has been the government of Norway's strategic value added, but they've insisted on giving these resources to religions collaborating together. They didn't just give their resources to their own local churches and their local religious communities. They gave these resources to a coalition of religious faith, different faith-inspired partners. This is strategic vision today. It isn't simply about engaging one religious institution or several. When Indigenous people seek to protect their land, they're not doing it for themselves. They're doing it for the entire country, nation, state in which they exist. They're doing it for the world. And where Indigenous peoples are protecting the rainforests today, they are protecting the rainforest as the lungs of the world. We owe them, each and every one of us, to ensure that our own faith institutions are collaborating with one another and with different governments to keep that space protected, to keep our lungs healthy. And therefore, I want to bring to your attention that the women, for the first time in COP history, women of faith from around the world have come together, spearheaded by Ms. Ravinder Kaur Nijjar, who is one of our senior-most Sikh women leaders. And together, they have added their voice to a statement in which they announce their own commitment. They don't just call upon others to do, to see, to this. They indicate their own commitment to stand side by side with one another and with anyone who will stand by them to defend our earth, to nurture this planet that we owe everything to. I wish to acknowledge that the focus of the discussion at the event today will be on faiths working with and empowering Indigenous peoples, and on the innovative work happening through the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative. Thank you for your attention here, and have a very, very rich and enriching set of presentations and discussions. Blessings.
Thank you, Professor Aza Karam, for your insightful and inspiring comments. It's now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Andreas Dahl-Jørgensen, the managing director of Norway's International Climate and Forest Initiative, or NICFI, as we like to call it. He's also the Deputy Director General at the Ministry of Climate and Environment in the Government of Norway. NICFI is Norway's flagship international climate initiative working to stop and reverse tropical deforestation. They've been active for decades. They're making a huge difference. Please, Andreas, take the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Charles, and thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be among such a distinguished group. I am not a religious leader. I do not claim to be an ethical leader, but I'm really pleased to be among all of you and to talk about such an important topic. I think this adds a very interesting complement here at the climate conference to what we saw yesterday. We saw breakthroughs on the global collaboration and initiatives to protect the world's remaining forests. Important commitments and pledges. We saw financial commitments. We saw important breakthroughs on supporting indigenous peoples and their livelihoods and their rights and their efforts to obtain tenure and rights over their territories. We saw global industries step up, commodity sectors, financial markets, to protect forest. And too often at these climate conferences, we talk about forests for the importance they have for the climate, or not often enough, I would say. But that is a very important element and emphasis here. And it is true that we will not meet our climate targets unless we protect the world's remaining forests. That's been said over and over and again, but I think it's worth never forgetting that. We have this decade to not only, it's not only about restoring nature 30 years from now, we have to protect what we have today. And I think the religious communities are an extremely powerful voice in talking about the importance of what they perceive, not as a stock of carbon, but as an iconic heritage, spiritually, as well as culturally. And so I think I'd like to really thank religious communities and leaders that we work with and everyone else for their leadership over generations, but crucially now in talk about all the various reasons and ethical reasons why we have to protect forests. Second point I'd like to make is that not only are religious leaders adding a very important ethical supplement and a reason for why we should protect forests, beyond all the other reasons for sort of our more, what should I say, material reasons or instrumental reasons for why we need to protect them, but for their own sake. But they also promote the actions needed. And there's a spiritual and ethical and religious reason for taking the actions that we need to protect forests. Too often, forests are lost for causes of greed or corruption or private gains, and you play a critical role in addressing those root causes of the destruction of our nature. You talk about the importance of, and you work with, and I'm very pleased to have Indigenous representatives here today that have preserved these forests and nature for millennia, and the critical role they have to play in any solution to protect forests. And again, I think we saw very important progress on that yesterday. And I would like to also thank Tom from the UK for the extraordinary leadership in making those commitments come through yesterday. And thirdly, I guess I'd like to thank you for not only speaking to the choir, but reaching beyond the choir. And I think the reach you have to all political parties of all colors, to business leaders, you play on strings that we cannot as technocrats, right? You make a business leader think twice where he wouldn't if a Norwegian bureaucrat would say, why don't you protect the forest? So I think that's a really important reason why we're so proud to work with you and to partner with your efforts to protect the forests around the world, and in particular in those 5 countries that you listed earlier. I And then before I forget, thank you for reminding me, both of you, that we should announce continued support. We're proud to, I'm honored to announce today that we're continuing the financial support for the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative for the next 3 years, and really look forward to engaging closely with all of you and all our partners to make that a success. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andreas Dahl-Jørgensen. What an exciting, important, and significant commitment the government of Norway has made, and I think I can speak for all of us. We're extremely grateful and looking forward to the next 3 years. Thank you. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Tom Clements, who is the Strategic Policy Advisor to the Secretary of State and Lord Goldsmith in the United Kingdom government. He works in the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and he'd like to share a few words with us now. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles, for inviting us to talk today on this really important subject. Yesterday, the COP presidency convened the World Leaders Summit, and we made the decision to try and put nature and forests at the heart of the climate discussion. And as part of that, we talked about the 3 systemic shifts that we wanted to see, or we wanted to enable, over the coming decade to try and deliver on the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration on Forests, which was endorsed now by nearly 130 countries. Those 3 systemic shifts were to shift the financial system, to shift the trade system, and to shift the discussion around Indigenous peoples and the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities as part of the solution to deliver on our goals for 2030. As part of that, a coalition of 14 government and private donors announced $1.7 billion over the next 5 years to support this really crucial effort. But our decision went beyond finance and included the fact that we wanted to put Indigenous peoples and local communities center stage with world leaders at the World Leaders Summit yesterday, which is what we did. Within the $1.7 billion, part of the UK contribution, and only part, is that we are going to commit £105 million for a new land facility to prepare and to support land governance reforms worldwide, including a specific focus on advancing the forest tenure rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. And that is a new group of funding that we are making available from now. In addition, as part of the pledge that we collectively committed to yesterday, the group of donors have committed to a coordination mechanism to hold ourselves to account to deliver on our commitments, including working together with Indigenous peoples and local communities representatives and ensuring that you are part of this conversation so that this is a collective effort. And secondly, we are committing to find new ways to channel support more effectively and at scale to you, directly to the communities, as much as is possible, in order to improve the effectiveness of how the funding is dispersed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom Clements. What an exciting, important, significant announcement, commitment that's made, and thank you for representing it here, and we're grateful for the focus on Indigenous peoples that you've emphasized. Thank you. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the Right Reverend Dr. Mark Andreas. He is the 8th Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of California and head of delegation for COP26. The Right Reverend Mark Andreas, his leadership is focused on key issues related to peace and justice, including immigration reform, civil rights, healthcare, and climate change. His climate advocacy is well known and appreciated, as well as his support for the Dakota Access Pipeline demonstrations at Standing Rock in North Dakota. It's been a pleasure working with Bishop Andreas in preparation for this event, and I welcome you and invite you to speak now.
Thank you, Dr. McNeill. It's an honor to be part of this circle of relations. I want first to say I'm speaking from San Francisco in the Bay Area of California, and the Diocese of California, the Episcopal Church in the Bay Area, is on land that was tended for generations by the Ohlone people here in San Francisco and the peninsula and the coastal Miwok across the Golden Gate Bridge and in the East Bay. I also want to say what an honor it is to be with the World Council of Churches, Religions for Peace, the Anglican Communion, of which the Episcopal Church is a province, and the tremendous work done by Interfaith Rainforest Initiative and this beautiful announcement from the UK government and their collaborators. What's so important about the IRI and the UK announcements of 3 more years of funding from Norway for the IRI and the new initiative from the UK is how it is being done in partnership with Indigenous peoples, not for them and not in spite of them or around Indigenous peoples, but with them, recognizing their essential role as guardians from time immemorial of the lands in which and on which they live, in which they are in a mutual relationship. What I'd like to say about the Episcopal Church, which is an international body within a global body, the Anglican Communion, it's 17 member nations. Many people think it's only the United States, but it is this much larger international body, is that we are learning to be a memory culture. And this is important with understanding our relationship to Indigenous peoples who are part of us and with whom we live in the 17 countries that make up our church. What do I mean by that? In Katowice, at the COP there, it was striking to me that some thousands of us who were so focused on climate change and the essential work of the COPs took time out to make what I call a pilgrimage to Auschwitz. And there, face to face with the horrors, the material signs of the horrors that were visited on Jews and Polish nationals and others in Auschwitz, I also learned something really startling. As soon as Auschwitz was liberated in 1945 by Soviet troops, within a year, survivors of Auschwitz themselves came back to prevent the further erasure of the material witness to what they had suffered. And they became the first curators and the first interpreters of what became a national and international site. There, in that, I learned what it means to become a memory culture. It is work, and it is work that the Episcopal Church is involved in. Beginning in 1997, and perhaps earlier, but I know in 1997 and forward, we have been in the work of repenting, of rethinking, of gaining a new mind that looks at the reality of who we are as agents of colonialism. Part of that has been to look at something called the Doctrine of Discovery and to learn about it. Here in our own diocese, we've been instructed and learned from the Reverend Brad Hoff, who is the Indigenous missioner for the Episcopal Church, about the Doctrine of Discovery. It's a whole set of doctrines and documents that are still living as they shape our worldview that began in the 1400s and gave permission to Western powers, white men largely, to dominate and enslave explicitly Indigenous peoples in what they called the New World, which was being claimed by different European powers. We have been learning how to undo how that has shaped our view of the world. And in so doing, our vision is being purified. Most recently, the movement called Black Lives Matter has raised our entire consciousness in the United States and around the world and in our church. And we've been seeing the intersectionality of justice with race and racial injustice. So what does a memory culture look like as we move forward? It will not mean that the dominating culture becomes exactly like the Indigenous peoples within the borders of what we tend as the Episcopal Church, nor does it mean that Indigenous peoples are accommodated as we have hoped that they would be in our sinful past to dominating, colonializing white culture. Rather, it means that we will discover a future together. Every week, we in the Episcopal Church, as part of the Christian faith, have a memory event where we celebrate Jesus' Last Supper with his friends. what comes forward in our belief is everything, not just Jesus himself, but his world and his struggle against the injustice of an empire. And it comes forward into our present. And we have the gift of being able to see the empire with which we have been entwined and are still entwined in our own world, and begin to see how we can emerge from that. In that emerging, we will be better partners, better family members with the indigenous people with whom we live. It is an honor to walk this earth with indigenous peoples who have resolutely held to their spirituality despite what has been done to them. I go back to the people returning to Auschwitz, to return to the place of trauma and the courage that took. This is the daily life of many indigenous people in this world. They are not returning to the place of trauma. They are living in a world with which they are deeply enmeshed in mutual love. And yet it is also the place of our traumatizing of them. We are repenting of that, and we'll move forward together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Mark Andreas, for your touching and deep words. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Chief Rabbi David Rosen, International Director, the Department of Interreligious Affairs, the American Jewish Committee, and co-president of Religions for Peace. Rabbi Rosen was the chief rabbi of Ireland and the senior rabbi of the largest Orthodox Jewish congregation in South Africa. Today, he is one of the most prominent Jewish leaders in the field of interreligious affairs. In 2005, Pope Benedict XVI made Rabbi Rosen a Knight of the Order of St. Gregory the Great for his contribution to promoting Catholic-Jewish reconciliation, and in 2010, he was made Commander of the British Empire by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth for his contribution to interfaith relations. Let's hear from Rabbi Rosen.
Religions teach that the world around us is not only our common home, it is the creation, the work of a higher universal and moral intelligence. And of course, the book of Psalms is replete with passages that testify to this awareness. The book of Genesis in the 2nd chapter, verse 15, tells us that humanity's purpose in this world is precisely to take care of the cosmos, to take care of our earth, to protect it in its development. And the 16th century Rabbi Judah Loewy of Prague declared that the degree to which we show love and care of creation and creatures is the degree to which we show our love of God. Our failure to care for creation and the creatures within it is, in fact, our failure to truly love God. So protecting our earth, protecting our world, protecting our natural ecosystem is a religious imperative. And it is so significantly threatened at this time that it becomes an imperative more than ever before, an imperative in which there has to be multi-religious collaboration, because it is truly a global challenge not only for nature itself, but for humanity, and especially for those humans most affected by the degradation of nature. As a result, I was so happy to have participated as one of the presidents of Religions for Peace in the launch of the Interfaith Rainforest initiative at the Nobel Peace Center in Oslo in June 2017, and to have been one of 900 representatives of religions from 125 countries who endorsed the Faiths for Forests Declaration and Action Agenda in August 2019, supporting the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative for the protection of rainforests and the rights of indigenous peoples. That agenda included a commitment to urge national governments and the international community to put forest protection at the center of efforts to reach the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. And I am delighted to support that commitment at this event here today. The Interfaith Rainforest Initiative is a most wonderful example of multi-faith collaboration for the environment and provides a unique platform for religious leaders to work shoulder to shoulder with indigenous peoples. I am truly inspired by the progress that has been made so far globally and in the programme countries, and I'm profoundly grateful to the Government of Norway for investing in this Interfaith Rainforest initiative and its agenda, and hope that other governments and organisations would follow suit. In 1910, one of the greatest rabbinic personalities of the 20th century, Rabbi Avraham Cohen-Cook, wrote a remarkable entry in his spiritual writings, emphasizing not only our mutual physical interdependence, but also our spiritual interdependence with all of creation. He wrote, "We need to be conscious of the special spiritual energy in all existence, in all the parts of the inanimate as well as plant and animal realms. We need to understand how much we impact on all existence and how much our environment influences us. We must unite with all peoples so that such ideals be joined with the dew of life to bring about the general betterment of all humankind. The radiance of life will then shine forth for the entire world." End of quote. I pray that we will not only succeed in saving creation, our common home, from the tragic degradation that threatens us all and desecrates the divine name, but that we may succeed in transforming the bitter into the sweet and to bring about the vision of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 55, verse 12. "You will go forth in joy and be led forward in peace. The mountains and hills will burst into song before you, and all the trees will clap their hands in applause." May we be privileged to witness the fulfillment of that vision.
And that is Rabbi Rosen. Thank you so much. The spiritual energy in all species burst into sound. Thank you so much. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the Archbishop Mark Mcdonald. The Most Reverend Mark Mcdonald became the Anglican Church of Canada's first national Indigenous Anglican bishop in 2007 after serving as Bishop of the U.S. Episcopal Diocese of Alaska for 10 years. In 2019, Bishop Mcdonald was elevated to Archbishop. He is also President of the World Council of Churches for North America. In 2013, Archbishop Mcdonald was awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in recognition of his spiritual leadership while serving Aboriginal communities and his contributions to environmental awareness of Canadians. Thank you, Archbishop Mark Mcdonald. Thank you for being here, and please take the floor.
Senedan na otli shalaknai. I wish you peace, and I call you all my relatives. Multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. Now those are the words of the prophet Joel, and if they aren't about today, they will certainly fit today until a more urgent time comes along. I think that it is essential for us to understand the moment we are in, and also the critical role that Indigenous peoples play in it. It was my great privilege to serve and continue to serve with the Gwich'in people, who are articulating some of these issues in a way that is prophetic to human future and also to the life of Indigenous people on the land. This work against development in their area has been hard for people in the broader culture to understand. It would appear that the culture of money that surrounds us and hypnotizes so much of the world's population keeps us from seeing the intimate connection that we have, the inseparable connection that we have with creation. So that what the Gwich'in tried to articulate about their relationship to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and particularly the porcupine caribou herd, was almost impossible for people to understand, because the larger culture has lost its understanding of its relationship to creation. We are human through creation and with creation. Today, an estimated between a fifth and a fourth of the world's usable land is under the oversight, the protocols, and the life of indigenous people. An estimated 80% of the biodiversity that is on this planet, all that biodiversity is under the oversight, the protocols, the life of indigenous people. So the rights of indigenous people, the life of indigenous people is so intimate to the future of the planet that there is no livable future for this planet that does not address the rights of indigenous people in a way that has never happened, at least in modern times. These two things are woven together in a way that they cannot be separated. Now, with that issue, there is something that is also critical to understand, and that is that the wisdom that we will need, the way of life that we will need in order to have a livable planet is also found within indigenous life and indigenous philosophy. Indigenous life is a braiding together of our solidarity and our communion in terms of spirit and spiritual life, braided together with our solidarity and our communion with humanity, and then braided together in our solidarity and communion with the rest of creation. This insight, which is the basis of indigenous culture, is also essential to our future. It is absolutely critical for us to understand that indigenous people and their life stand in a prophetic relationship with humanity's future. Let us take heed, let us listen, let us understand, for in this we will find life. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Mark McDonald. You are in a unique position to be able to speak with such wisdom from a multiple set of faiths. Thank you. It's now my honor to introduce Reverend Mari Valjaka, who is a pastor of Sami at the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland and moderator of the Indigenous Peoples Reference Group of the World Council of Churches. Reverend Mari, please.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. The Arctic is warming faster, you might say even 3 times faster than any other region in this planet. In the Arctic area, we are also putting our hope to the energy transition, and we are also putting our hope to the sustainable future. But at the same time, we need to ask if there could be justice for indigenous peoples while and when seeking our way to the better future and sustainable living. Many Sami people is now talking about green colonialism. We're feeling heavy pressure from mining companies, but also from the renewable energy industries. You could say that we live in the remote area, and what's better place for mining, logging, and wind industry than our homeland? But here's the point. We are still here. We are still living there and practicing our traditional livelihoods. fishing, reindeer herding, etc. Our land is sacred to us. It gives us life and shelter. It is our home and our church. For example, right now we are facing massive windmill park plans to our homeland, Sápmi. So somehow it feels that now we indigenous peoples are getting energy transition to our shoulders. And that can't be right. And don't get me wrong, wind power can be good. And for example, in Finland, we have municipalities outside the Sami homeland that are really eager to get these wind parks in their area. But having those in Sami area is really concerning Sami people because the consequences to the animals, to the nature, to the human life in this area can be massive. We don't want to save our planet only for the next generation, but also for the generation after that and even after that. But for indigenous generations, there won't be nothing left in their homeland if this is the way we want to do things. So protection of creation is central to the mission of the Church. We humans are called to protect all creation. Indigenous peoples of the world are the protectors of ecosystem and have been caretakers of the earth for centuries. We have a connection to the land, to the planet A, to the Mother Earth. We have wisdom to share, but our knowledge has been devalued. We think that indigenous perspectives are crucial not only for addressing the burgeoning climate emergency, but also for navigating the way forward to a hopeful post-COVID, post-growth, post-fossil fuel future. We need to remind our political leaders that all of us, but especially Sami people and other indigenous peoples living in the Arctic or Pacific, Amazons or Asia, already suffer from the effects of climate change in front line. Melting sea ice, rising sea levels, extreme phenomena of weather, floods, forest fires, etc. Those things are already happening and affecting to our lives and traditional livelihoods in many ways. Many times indigenous peoples have been discriminated and left outside alone from decision making. Now we must be included in finding sustainable solutions for all. I believe that we can't be the ones who solves all the problems, and especially we can't be the ones who pays the price from the energy transition, but we have wisdom to share. Now we are asking, can there be justice for indigenous peoples when and while seeking climate justice? And I'm responding to my question. I think that there can't be climate justice if there is no justice for indigenous people. And this is why we need to be treated as active subjects and not just passive objects in the decision making. We need to be consulted when making decisions that affect our lives, our land, our culture, our traditional livelihoods. I just want to say that if this can happen to a Sami people, what else can happen to our indigenous brothers and sisters around the globe? For our brothers and sisters who are even more marginalized and discriminated in their societies. In this context, we want to remind all people, and especially decision makers, of their responsibility to ensure that vulnerable groups are not subjected to creator struggles. As followers of Christ, we are called to fight for creation, for human dignity and rights, as well as to fight against injustice. All of us have much to learn from indigenous perspective, and our hope is to get our voices heard. Our hope is to get our wisdom shared. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Mari. I'm struck from your comments how the issues confronting indigenous peoples in the north are very similar to those in the south. The value created for the planet and all life on the planet in the north and the south are also similar, and the need for indigenous peoples to be engaged, consulted on all developments on their lands needs to be reinforced. Thank you so much for your comments. It's now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Joseph Itongua, who is chair of the board of directors of the Indigenous Peoples Network for the Sustainable Management of Forest Ecosystems. I've had the privilege of working with Joseph for many years now, in addition to creating his own organization where he coordinates work all over the Democratic Republic of Congo. He also serves as a director or coordinator of a number of local and provincial organizations defending human and indigenous people's rights. Please join me in welcoming Joseph Itongua, and he will be translated from French into English by Mr. Lionel Dis from the Rainforest Foundation, Norway. Please go ahead, Mr. Joseph, and we'll have a simultaneous translation. Thank you, Lionel.
Merci beaucoup pour m'avoir donné cette opportunité.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
L'initiative interreligieuse pour les forêts tropicales a constitué une opportunité pour créer une alliance stratégique pour nous aider à protéger nos droits
to help us protect our rights in the DRC
et aussi protéger la forêt.
and also protect the forest.
155 millions d'hectares
155 million
notre pays,
hectares
la République démocratique du
forest
Congo,
in DRC
ont vraiment de base de conservation par nos pratiques traditionnelles.
have been conserved thanks to our traditional practices.
Des soutiens bien
But
avant parce
our
que
territories
n'avons pas
have
eu
not been
une collaboration
supported
depuis longtemps avec les religieux.
before, so we
Mais
haven't
avec
had
l'initiative
any
interreligieuse pour les forêts
coordination
tropicales,
with
nous
religious faith.
avons
Now with
constitué un
the
forum
RI,
de
we have
collaboration
put in place
qui nous a permis
forum
réellement d'engager
that
des
enable
efforts,
us to
de
engage
pouvoir discuter
efforts
des questions de
to
changement
discuss
climatique, des questions de protection des forêts,
climate
également des
change,
questions des
protection
droits
of
des peuples
forest,
autochtones.
and the voices of indigenous
Et en
peoples.
2019,
And in
quand l'initiative était
2019,
lancée en République
when the
démocratique du
initiative
Congo,
was
en décembre,
launched in
est
DRC in
ressortie une
December,
déclaration
a
de
declaration
l'initiative
was
interreligieuse,
produced
une
from the
déclaration pour la
RI
protection des forêts de la
for the
République démocratique
protection
du Congo,
of the
mais
forests
qui a
in
intégré
DRC,
spécifiquement
which integrated as
les
well
rôles
specifically
des
the
peuples
role
autochtones
of indigenous
pour garantir
peoples to
la
protect
sécurisation et la protection des forêts de la
and
République
secure
Et cet engagement des religieux
forests
et
in
des parties
DRC.
prenantes
And this engagement
à la
of
République démocratique
religious
du
faith
Congo a été
in
suivi
DRC
par une feuille de route des actions
has been followed
dans
by
lesquelles
putting in place a
les
roadmap
religieux s'étaient engagés pour
of actions
nous aider
where
à
religious
protection- à
leaders
protéger
have
nos
engaged
droits.
themselves to
Et
protect
c'est
the rights of
l'état
indigenous peoples.
de l'adoption de la loi, de la proposition de loi sur
And the
le-
state
notre
has
droit qui a
actually
été adopté le 7 avril
followed
2021
several
à
advice,
l'Assemblée nationale.
including
Les religieux s'étaient engagés
elaboration
beaucoup
of indigenous
nous aider
people's
et nous
rights
appuyer
legislation.
dans les actions
And
et les
the
lobbies
religious leaders
afin
have really
que,
supported
cette
our
loi puisse
advocacy
passer au Parlement.
to ensure
Bien
that this
sûr qu'il
legislation
reste encore les étapes du Sénat
can be
et la
pushed
promulgation
forward
de la loi
in the Parliament,
par le chef de
even if there
l'État
are
et où
still
nous aurons encore
steps to be
besoin
taken to ensure
réellement des
final
actions et
adoption.
des soutiens des religieux. L'initiative interreligieuse aussi
The
a ouvert
RI
le chapitre au niveau
has
des
also
provinces.
opened
Parce
local
que c'est là où il y a les
chapters in the
menaces,
different provinces
c'est là
in
où il y a
DRC, because
les actions,
that's
c'est là
where
où il y a
there
les
are
facteurs
threats, actions,
qui
and
détruisent les forêts.
factors
Et nous avons salué
which destroy the forests.
cet engagement des religieux
So
au
we're
niveau
really
de province,
recognizing this
au niveau
engagement
local,
of
pour continuer à
religious
sensibiliser
leaders to
les
mobilize
autorités locales, mais
locally,
aussi
mobilize,
influencer les lois
influence
locales
local
et sur tous les
authorities,
facteurs et les acteurs qui détruisent les
but
forêts
also the
et
different
qui
actors
ne respectent
and
pas les droits des
threatening
peuples
the forest
autochtones.
and are not
Donc,
respecting
nous avons
the
besoin
rights of
de
indigenous
plus
peoples.
d'appui.
So
Nous avons besoin, dans cette
need
collaboration
more support
avec les religieux,
in this
c'est bien qu'il y ait
collaboration
des
with
engagements des
religious
fonds
leaders.
au niveau des autorités, au niveau des
It is
décideurs,
very positive
mais
with,
ces appuis
pledges
nécessitent
for
vraiment
increased
être
support
orientés vers les actions
for
que
our
les religieux
work.
sont en train de mener en collaboration avec les peuples autochtones
And
dans
this
les
includes
différentes
as well these
réformes
actions
pour
and
protéger
coordination between
non seulement les
the
forêts,
religious beliefs,
protéger les
the
droits
religious
pour
leaders,
l'intérêt
and
global
indigenous people's
en vue de lutter
organizations
contre les
to,
crises des changements climatiques.
fight climate change, Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Of wisdom, thank you for your leadership in the Democratic Republic of Congo, not only for the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, but for decades of work on behalf of the Pygmy, the indigenous peoples of DRC. The last speaker in this session, which is focusing on how the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative experience as a best practice in implementing high-level commitments, is taking place. This session will conclude with Bishop Francisco Duque. And Francisco Duque is another inspiring leader. He is the fourth and current bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Columbia. That's an Anglican diocese in Colombia. He's also president of the Interreligious Council of Colombia. Bishop Duque has been a dynamic leader of the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative in Colombia, both in launching the program and realizing its many achievements since then. Please, let's hear from Bishop Francisco Duque.
Hacer la paz con la naturaleza atendiendo a la llamada de los pueblos indígenas. Me cabe el honor de representar a la iniciativa interreligiosa para los bosques tropicales IRI en esta sesión de trabajo de la Conferencia de las Naciones Unidas sobre Cambio Climático. Como líder religioso y miembro de la iniciativa, siento, valga la paradoja, un humilde pero gran orgullo por los avances y logros que hemos obtenido en Indonesia, República Democrática del Congo, Perú, Brasil y Colombia en un periodo de tiempo relativamente corto. La iniciativa interreligiosa para los bosques tropicales nació en el Centro Nobel de la Paz en junio del 2017 como una alianza internacional que trabaja para aprovechar la influencia moral, ética y política de las religiones y sus líderes en favor de la protección de los bosques y de sus comunidades guardianas. IRI proporciona a los líderes religiosos una plataforma de comunicación, articulación, para actuar con urgencia a favor de los bosques tropicales y de los derechos de los habitantes ancestrales. Esta plataforma se estructura a partir de una premisa simple pero poderosa. Todas las creencias religiosas y espiritualidades comparten el imperativo de proteger a los árboles y a los bosques y a los habitantes. De esta premisa deriva el poder espiritual, moral y político de la iniciativa, a saber, reconocer que tenemos la responsabilidad moral y espiritual social de concientizar sobre la gravedad de la deforestación, de actuar con urgencia para detener la pérdida de bosques y de su biodiversidad, de inspirar a nuestras congregaciones y comunidades de fe con el fin de actuar para restaurar los bosques y los suelos y de influir para que las autoridades y empresas se tomen con seriedad sus deberes frente a la justicia ambiental. El lanzamiento de la iniciativa interreligiosa para los bosques tropicales en Colombia tuvo lugar en noviembre del 2018. Desde entonces, en IRI Colombia, hacemos presencia en los municipios amazónicos más afectados por la deforestación, con 35 capítulos locales. Desde allí, hemos recorrido un camino que nos ha mostrado la oportunidad de innovación metodológica y de crecimiento que nos permite ser optimistas sobre el futuro. El video IRI Colombia en Acción, que proyectaremos a continuación, es un recurso pedagógico que facilita la comprensión de nuestra misión y la forma de realizarla.
Los bosques de Colombia son milagros de la creación. Son el hogar de especies que no se encuentran en ningún otro lugar del planeta. Regulan nuestro clima y nos proporcionan alimentos, agua, medicinas y medios de vida. Trágicamente, están siendo destruidos ante nuestros ojos, para la ganadería extensiva, para la agroindustria, para la minería ilegal y para los cultivos de uso ilícito. Esto crea grandes problemas para nuestro pueblo, acelera el cambio climático e impulsa la extinción de especies, conduce a la inseguridad alimentaria, resulta en enfermedades como los coronavirus, y amenaza a los pueblos indígenas que han preservado los bosques durante generaciones. Sin bosques no hay futuro. Por eso lanzamos la iniciativa interreligiosa para los bosques tropicales de Colombia, para traer el poder y la influencia de los líderes religiosos a la protección de los bosques. Líderes religiosos, pueblos indígenas, las ONG, las Naciones Unidas, los científicos, autoridades gubernamentales. Somos una coalición que trabaja en todos los sectores para poner fin a la deforestación. ¿Cómo trabajamos? 1. Educamos y concientizamos a través de capacitaciones y campañas. Compartimos los últimos datos sobre los bosques, el cambio climático y los derechos humanos. De esta manera, equipamos a los líderes religiosos para que entren en acción, para incorporar el cuidado de los bosques en sus enseñanzas religiosas, para hablar públicamente sobre la deforestación y para reunir en sus lugares de culto para actuar. 2. Movilizamos la acción sobre el terreno. Donde los bosques se enfrentan a las mayores amenazas, lanzamos capítulos locales. Cada uno de ellos es una coalición de líderes religiosos que trabajan hombro a hombro con los pueblos indígenas locales, los científicos y las ONG en planes de acción para proteger los bosques de esa región. Estamos activos desde San Vicente del Caguán, Cartagena del Chairá, San José del Guaviare, La Macarena, Puerto Guzmán, Puerto Asís, Calamar, El Retorno, Miraflores, Solano, Puerto Rico y más allá. Hemos entrenado y movilizado a miles de líderes religiosos y el movimiento está creciendo. 3. Abogamos por el cambio y la aplicación de políticas, porque detener la deforestación se reduce a la voluntad política. Nos reunimos con alcaldes, concejales, gobernadores, miembros del Congreso y ministros para exigir acción. Llevamos a cabo debates públicos, aseguramos compromisos y monitoreamos el progreso en la protección de nuestros bosques. Nuestro mensaje es simple: adoptar, cumplir y ampliar los compromisos de protección de los bosques de Colombia y sus guardianes. Somos testigos para acompañar la formulación de políticas locales y nacionales para asegurar la justicia para los bosques y los pueblos indígenas. 4. Influimos en el sector privado. Nuestro objetivo es eliminar la deforestación de la producción de alimentos, en particular de la carne de vacuno y de cultivos agroindustriales. También abogamos por la desinversión en empresas que tienen como objetivo obtener beneficios de la deforestación, como la minería, la exploración de petróleo y gas y la tala comercial. Como comunidades religiosas, nuestras carteras de inversión son grandes. Invertimos con conciencia y dejamos que las empresas sepan dónde estamos. Hacemos que las empresas rindan cuentas de sus políticas y prácticas. Muchos credos, un solo propósito. Abogamos por los bosques, abogamos por la justicia climática, abogamos por los pueblos indígenas. Los bosques son nuestro futuro y el momento de actuar es ahora. La iniciativa interreligiosa para los bosques tropicales de Colombia. Únase a nosotros.
Entre los principales logros de IRI Colombia se encuentra la formación e implementación de planes de acción que influyen acciones de formación y sensibilización sobre la importancia de los bosques, actividades de reforestación y restauración de áreas de bosques y de pequeñas cuencas hídricas degradadas y actividades pastorales que afectan y buscan hacer de la espiritualidad eclesial un factor de cambio social orientado a la búsqueda de la justicia ambiental. NICFI Colombia también ha capacitado a decenas de líderes religiosos y miembros de comunidades de fe sobre estrategias de acción pastoral para la transformación ambiental, el diseño de planes de acción, protección ambiental y participación ciudadana para la protección de la Amazonía. En NICFI Colombia buscamos innovar la capacitación mediante tecnologías de información aplicables a la educación. En el ámbito nacional, impulsamos la adopción de disposiciones para la protección de la Amazonía en el Plan Nacional de Desarrollo y apoyamos la aprobación de la Ley 2111, mediante la cual se creó el delito de la deforestación. Desde el nivel local, hemos avanzado en la creación de frentes municipales, parlamentarios para la protección de la Amazonía. En el ámbito empresarial, estamos diseñando acuerdos de voluntades entre NICFI Colombia y las cámaras de comercio para coordinar acciones de concientización y protección de la selva amazónica entre la industria y los comerciantes. El año pasado no se aprobó el acuerdo de Escazú, sin embargo, NICFI Colombia persistirá en la acción de incidencia para lograr que el Estado colombiano adopte este acuerdo. La iniciativa interreligiosa para los bosques tropicales debe reconocer con aprecio y agradecimiento el reconocimiento que ha proporcionado el gobierno noruego, que ha invertido más de 3.000 millones de dólares a lo largo de esta última década para apoyar los esfuerzos de los países en desarrollo para reducir la deforestación y la degradación de los bosques. Noruega se ha comprometido a mantener el compromiso con similares grados de ambientación hasta el 2030. La iniciativa expresa su esperanza de que en esta hora crítica de definición, todos los gobiernos y organizaciones sigan el generoso ejemplo de Noruega. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bishop Duque. And yes, your last comment, it would be wonderful if all the governments of the world were to follow the example of the government of Norway. Thank you for that, and thank you for your inspiring work there in Colombia and elsewhere. We are just on time. We have exactly 9 minutes left for our last three speakers. Before I introduce them, I wanted to say, imagine the impacts you're hearing about the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative in Colombia. Multiply that by the country of Peru, Indonesia, Democratic Republic, and Brazil, and you can imagine the impact of the program around the world. Finally, these are the distinguished discussants. I'm excited to introduce Reverend Henrik Grappe, Senior Advisor on Care for Creation, Sustainability, and Climate Justice of the World Council of Churches. Reverend Grappe also serves as a representative of the World Council of Churches on the Global Steering Committee of IRI, and he's a coordinator of the World Council of Churches Working Group on Climate Change. I have a question for you, Reverend Grappe. You and the World Council of Churches were founding members of IRI, and you've sustained your engagement since the beginning. Clearly, WCC has a strong commitment to averting climate catastrophe and to empowering Indigenous peoples. But I'm hearing during this event and elsewhere that Anglicans and Episcopalians and other faiths are undergoing a kind of transformation in the way they are opening up to and even embracing the need to respect and protect Indigenous peoples' rights and spirituality. A break with 500 years of tradition. And I understand you're doing this not only as the right thing to do from a human rights and a environmental justice perspective, but also with a view to a new kind of partnership with Indigenous peoples to address the climate crisis. Is this correct? Is this really happening in your view? And can you say a bit more about it if it is?
Yeah, thank you. I think partly you are right. We are in a very emergent situation today, and the
the concept of the world built on an extractive economy, on a very anthropocentric worldview, is what we are fighting against. And this has put you in this emergent situation. We have to reclaim the interdependence, the knowledge of interdependence on ecosystem. We have to reclaim that, and we have to leave this extractive economy that we built on. And we cannot do this without being led by indigenous spirituality. We heard today from the understanding of, first, the long-term vision to be on this earth. Also, how we are interdependent on all life that is around us. We are breathing in this room every day oxygen. That comes from the ecosystem. We are not apart from the nature. We are a part of nature. And to make peace with Earth is to make peace on Earth. So this is the way we have to reclaim that feeling of understanding of interdependence, and we have to do it. We need our indigenous people and the indigenous spirituality that we have in our churches, in our different faith traditions, and that is something that we really want to do to actually overcome the climate threats we see, and deforestation is, of course, a part of that.
Thank you so much. That's incredibly inspiring and encouraging a new kind of relationship between non-Indigenous world religions and Indigenous peoples. That's very, very exciting and significant. Thank you so much. Now I have a question and I want to introduce, first of all, our next and second to last speaker, Ms. Ravinder Kaur Nijjar, Chair of Religions for Peace, United Kingdom, Women of Faith Network, and Sikh representative in the Scottish Religious Leaders Forum. Lots to say about her background, but just one thing I'll say is that she was awarded the Scottish Asian Women's Lifetime Achievement Award in 2013. And I have a question for you, if you don't mind, Ms. Ravinder. You've been a leader of the effort that led to the Women of Faith statement that Professor Karam mentioned at the beginning of our program. Can you tell us a bit more about that effort, and what should government leaders do to respond to the statement that you and others have taken to protect the climate and other aspects of the environment?
Thank you. Well, the reason why this statement was made is that the climate crisis affects women disproportionately. They make up to 60% of the global poor and are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change due to their different and unequal social roles and status, and have less say in the decision-making processes. So the voice of the voiceless needs to be heard. The statement was produced and signed by over 48 women of faith leaders around the world in over 90 different countries. It affirms our sustained commitment to work with the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative. We recognize that there is no solution to the climate crisis without protecting the rainforests and its indigenous peoples. Quite simply, the reason it was produced because no one else is bringing the urgent need of the problems facing women in poorer countries due to climate change. Women have been the caretakers of our environment across all cultures, and particularly Indigenous women have nourished our biodiversity and ecosystems and recognize that all forms of life are sacred. We cannot, as custodians of the planet, allow the destruction and devastation of life on our planet. As chair of the UK Women of Faith Network, I had the opportunity to personally deliver the statement to Prince Charles. It has been mentioned in local media and national media, and I hope it will go worldwide now. And only last night I was able to publicize it at the Faith in Action for Clusters Climate Justice handover event when we handed over all declarations, petitions, and statements. Political leaders and governments need to take action urgently, and there is no space for talk. I was able to take part in the UNFCCC Gender Action Work Plan meeting yesterday, and noticeably men were absent. At the workshop, the role and work of national gender and climate change focal points were discussed. And as usual, the same issues of raising awareness, capacity building within delegations and government organizations were discussed. Gender issues affect us all and need to permeate every governmental organization, think tank and body. And we need to ask, are the voices of women being heard, and are the policies being implemented using their voices? And it was heartening to hear yesterday that world leaders pledged to end and reverse deforestation by 2030. Therefore, again, we applaud the important work happening through the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative, and please count on our continued support and prayers for the success of these crucial endeavors for all people and our planet, Mother Earth.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ravender. Very clear, very powerful, very welcome. The last speaker, Reverend Rachel Tabor Hamilton, is a Shakan First Nation woman and rector of Trinity Episcopal Church in the state of Washington, which serves as a hub congregation supporting advocacy work for refugees and immigrants in the Episcopal Diocese of Western Washington. She is a committed advocate for social justice concerns and restorative justice and civic policy development. I can say more, but please let me turn over the floor to Ms. Rachel Tabor Hamilton. Reverend Rachel, you have a distinguished background in folklore studies and symbol systems, and so I'd like to ask you a controversial question. What are the consequences of the cultural story or narrative that a society takes on and adopts on the human relationship with the natural world? And how can we change our Western cultural story? Reverend Henrik was referring to this. How can we change this story or narrative so that we can actually be alive at the end of this story? In other words, how can we change our story, our Western story, so that we can have a different future than the crisis-filled ones we are headed into on climate and other issues?
Thank you very much for that framing. And I think that the idea of story is exactly right. And it's exactly something that theologians from all world traditions really engage when they're talking about theology. And specifically in our case today, when we're talking about our relationship, our human relationship with the environment, with the world, as we put that in context of our relationship with the sacred, how we name that sacred, how we talk about our powerful and passionate stories that come from our ancestors of all kinds and all peoples, how we talk about how those stories contributed not only to our survival as people, but enabled us to thrive. The clash of cultural stories is in part what I see in play. We've heard some of our speakers, for example, talk about the Doctrine of Discovery. That is a powerful story that is still in play in our interactions globally today with Indigenous peoples and with our environments. The Doctrine of Discovery was something that came from our 15th and 16th century European explorers. They brought with them more than goods and the ability to create forts and the ability to create genocide. They brought with them a theology, a story, a particular framing of Christianity that empowered them, that made it okay, that justified the genocide of peoples, the enslavement of other peoples, and the use and abuse of the environment around them, an environment which in North America's and in any country, any nation, any continent in which colonists came, they brought with them a worldview that had devastating effect, that basically had a Christianity behind it that said it was God's will to do genocide, to enslave peoples, and to essentially eradicate entire environments for commercial gain, saying that those things had been created by a God that had made those things just for them. Those people who tended to be white and privileged and European, those people with power, with guns and germs and warfare. The Indigenous peoples across the globe everywhere were raised generationally within their particular biomes, their particular environments with which they created and arose with story. They brought with them a sense of how they related to that creation. They brought with them through the generations from passing like a bucket of water, putting in a little bit, taking out a little bit, so that they understood how they would relate to that sacred. Now, Western Christianity and Western or dominant cultural traditions tend to want to say that what they talk about in relationship with God is theology, whereas what Indigenous peoples talk about the sacred is classified by dominant culture as folklore. And I tell you now that unless our theologians of all kinds begin to listen closely to the theologies of indigenous peoples, we will not survive, not only as a race, but as a world. Because in those stories, which are genuinely deep and profound theologies of the sacred, of creation, there is relationship with place and relationship with other, relationship with plants, relationship with animals that sees and frames the world that God has created as deeply and profoundly sacred. That is a relationship for which we all hunger. And that story is actually the true story of Christianity. It isn't the story that was brought over in the 15th and 16th centuries that basically found its foundation in the empires of Constantine and Theodosius, but rather what happens before the 4th century, what happens from Jesus himself. The story of being so connected to place that they too resisted empire, that they too resisted their own exploitation of resources and peoples against Roman occupation. That is the Christian story, and it does not ever end in death. It only ever leads us all to renewal. And so I call upon our theologians of indigenous kind, of dominant culture kind, of all kind, to create a new story, because it's not so much an innovation as it is a reclamation of what is genuinely authentic to our truest selves and ancestry for all humankind. A story that talks about rebirth, a story that talks about sacred relationship with creation, a story that is much more indigenous to every human being on the planet that gave them birth. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Reverend Rachel, for your call for a new story, a new narrative for humankind, for a new future. I want to conclude this event with just 4 points. I'm hearing that religious leaders and faith communities are coming on board to attack the climate crisis in a whole new way. Number 2, religious leaders and indigenous peoples are partnering also in a whole new way on the climate crisis, including through the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative. 3, indigenous peoples, north and south, share ways of life and assets the entire world depends on. Number 4, there's no solution to the climate crisis without respecting and ensuring the rights and spirituality of indigenous peoples. Thanks to our distinguished speakers, thanks to the participants around the world. Thank you very much. We close the event now.